Introduction to Law Tutorial 2 Group 3. Introduction. In these modern days, Malaysian courts continue to apply legal principles that originate from the United Kingdom. Despite having our own constitution and written laws, English common law and equity continue to influence Malaysia's legal system through the Civil Law Act 1956, which acts as a legal bridge between English law and Malaysian law. Under Section 3 of the Civil Law Act 1956, Malaysian courts may apply English common law and rules of equity when there is a gap in local law, as long as those principles are suitable to Malaysian conditions. Meanwhile, Section 6 focuses on land-related matters, placing clear restrictions on the use of English common law in cases involving immovable property, and ensuring that such matters are governed primarily by Malaysia's own statutory and legal framework. Malaysian courts have carefully interpreted these provisions to ensure that English law is applied only where appropriate and does not override local statutes. There are two cases that can be used to show how Malaysian courts apply Sections 3 and 6 of the Civil Law Act 1956, striking a careful balance between adopting English legal principles and respecting local laws.
First and foremost, the case of Peter Chong and another and Khatijah binti Muhammad Ibrahim and another, personal representative of Aisha binti Ibrahim, the deceased, and another suit concerned a dispute over land held under joint tenancy in Penang. In 1940, Muhammad Ibrahim, a Muslim, purchased a piece of land and by the same deed conveyed it to his children as joint tenants, while retaining possession during his lifetime. Upon Ibrahim's death, only two of his children, Aisha and Khatijah, survived and were registered as joint tenants under the National Land Code, Penang and Malacca Titles, Act 1963. In 1990, Aisha unilaterally entered into two sale and purchase agreements with the plaintiffs for portions of the land. The plaintiffs paid the full purchase price and took possession, but no transfer or registration of the land was in effect. Aisha died in 1998, after which Khatijah became the sole registered proprietor by right of survivorship. The plaintiff subsequently brought action seeking specific performance of the agreements. After an initial dismissal and a successful appeal, the matter was retried on the limited issue of whether the original conveyance was governed by Islamic law such that the doctrine of survivorship could not validly operate. The issue related to the application of common law and equity in Malaysia is whether the gift of land by Ibrahim to his children as joint tenants was subject to Islamic, Mohammedan, law, and if so, whether it was repugnant to that law. The court held that the gift of land by Muhammad Ibrahim to his children as joint tenants was not subject to Islamic, Mohammedan, law and was therefore not repugnant or invalid. The conveyance was governed by the applicable civil law on land and conveyancing in Penang at the material time, and the joint tenancy created by the deed was valid in law. Consequently, the plaintiff's contention that the joint tenancy and its survivorship effect were invalid for offending Islamic law was rejected. The ratio decidandi for this decision is due to the fact that the legal validity of the 1940 conveyance by Muhammad Ibrahim, which created a joint tenancy, was governed solely by the civil land law applicable in Penang at the material time and was not subject to Islamic, Mohammedan, law. Although Islamic law formed part of the customary legal framework, its application was statutorily limited by the Mohammedan's ordinance to matters of marriage and intestacy unless otherwise provided. As the conveyance was an inter vivos transfer of a movable property affected by deed and registration, it fell outside Islamic law and was governed by the Conveyancing and Law of Property Ordinance and the Registration of Deeds Ordinance then in force in Penang. Furthermore, the court reasoned that the reception of English law into Malaysian land law was subject to strict statutory limits. By virtue of Section 5(2) of the Civil Law Ordinance and reaffirmed by Section 6 of the Civil Law Act 1956, no part of English law relating to the tenure, conveyance, assurance, or succession of a movable property cannot apply unless expressly embodied in local legislation. Accordingly, while English law provided the historical framework for land conveyancing in Penang, English common law principles relating to immovable property and survivorship could not be applied independently of statute, and the effect of joint tenancy had to be determined strictly in accordance with local land legislation. The conveyance therefore had to be interpreted strictly in accordance with the statutory land regime, which recognized joint tenancy and survivorship. In addition, the court further observed, by reference to Rehman bin Mihat, DECD, that even if Islamic law were assumed to apply, inter vivos dispositions by Muslims are recognized and not subject with Islamic inheritance rules, thereby reinforcing the validity of the conveyance. Such a disposition did not offend Islamic principles even if Islamic law were assumed to apply, as inter vivos gifts by Muslims are not subject to the rigid rules of Islamic inheritance. Consequently, the joint tenancy created by the deed was neither repugnant to Islamic law nor invalid under civil law. The necessary legal conclusion flowing from these principles was that the joint tenancy was validly created and remained effective, thereby defeating the plaintiff's argument that the conveyance was void or legally defective. Besides that, in determining this issue, the court applied the doctrine of stare decisis by following established judicial authorities that delimit the scope of Islamic law and English common law in relation to inter vivos dispositions of immovable property in Malaysia. The court relied on Rehman bin Mihat, DECD as binding authority for the proposition that a Muslim may validly dispose of property during his lifetime under civil law without contravening Islamic principles, and that such dispositions are not governed by the rules of Islamic inheritance. This precedent was directly applicable as it concerned an inter vivos arrangement created by a Muslim and upheld under civil law, thereby supporting the validity of the joint tenancy in the present case. Moreover, the court adhered to the principle laid down in Khu Hui Leong v Khu Chong Yok, which established that English law applies in Penang only to the extent that it has been expressly received and modified by local legislation. By following this authority, the court reaffirmed that English common law principles relating to immovable property cannot be applied wholesale and must yield to statutory limitations, particularly those imposed by the Civil Law Act. The court also distinguished Salmar Bt Omar and Ors v Ahmed Rosli bin Aziz, administrator of the estate of Osman bin Muhammad, deceased, and Anor, clarifying that its application was confined to intestate succession and did not extend to inter vivos conveyances, thereby preventing an improper extension of precedent beyond its factual and legal context. Through this adherence to binding and persuasive authorities, the court maintained consistency and certainty in the law governing land conveyancing and the application of Islamic law, illustrating the operation of stare decisis by applying established legal principles to materially similar facts while distinguishing cases that addressed fundamentally different legal issues. In conclusion, the court dismissed the plaintiff's claims against the first defendant, Khatijah, who became the sole registered proprietor of the land by right of survivorship upon Aisha's death. The court held that the joint tenancy created by the 1940 conveyance was valid, was not subject to Islamic, Mohammedan, law, and had not been severed by Aisha's unilateral dealings. As a result, the plaintiffs were not entitled to specific performance or any proprietary relief against Khatijah. However, the court allowed the plaintiff's claim against the second defendant, being the estate of Aisha, on the basis of restitution. Since the sale and purchase agreements were unenforceable for want of capacity and title, the estate was ordered to refund the purchase price received from the plaintiffs pursuant to Section 66 of the Contracts Act 1950. Each party was ordered to bear its own costs.
Secondly, the case of Kaz versus MPPL and another concerned a dispute over the determination of a child's biological paternity. The plaintiff claimed to be the biological father of a child, born in 2008 to the first defendant, who was validly married to the second defendant at the time of the child's birth. The plaintiff alleged that he had an intimate relationship with the first defendant before and during her marriage, including during the period of conception. He further claimed that he had been involved in the child's life for several years, and had provided financial maintenance for the child. The defendants denied that the plaintiff was the biological father and relied on the statutory presumption of legitimacy under Section 112 of the Evidence Act, 1950, contending that the child was conclusively presumed to be the legitimate child of the husband. The plaintiff subsequently applied to the High Court for an order compelling the child to undergo a DNA test to conclusively determine biological paternity. The issue related to the application of common law and equity in Malaysia is whether the High Court has the power, under English common law and its inherent jurisdiction as parens patriae, to order a child to undergo a DNA test to determine paternity, in the absence of express statutory authority in Malaysia. The High Court held that it has the power to order a child to undergo a DNA test to determine paternity. The court ruled that this power arises from its inherent jurisdiction as parens patriae, and is supported by English common law principles applied as persuasive guidance under Section 3(1) of the Civil Law Act 1956, particularly where there is no written law regulating DNA testing for paternity, and where such an order is necessary to protect the best interests and welfare of the child. The ratio decidendi for this decision is due to the fact that although there is no express statutory provision in Malaysian law empowering courts to compel a child to undergo DNA testing for paternity, such power exists under the court's inherent jurisdiction as parens patriae. which obliges the court to act as the guardian of minors and to safeguard their welfare. This inherent jurisdiction is supplemented by English common law principles, which may be applied in Malaysia pursuant to Section 3(1) of the Civil Law Act 1956, to fill lacunae in domestic law, where such intervention is necessary to protect the welfare and best interests of a child. Furthermore, the court reasoned that the presumption of legitimacy under Section 112 of the Evidence Act 1950 does not preclude judicial inquiry into biological paternity, as legitimacy is a matter of legal status, whereas paternity is a question of fact. Accordingly, the existence of a valid marriage at the time of the child's birth does not bar the court from determining biological parentage, where credible evidence raises a genuine dispute as to paternity. In exercising its inherent jurisdiction, the court emphasized that an order for DNA testing must not be made lightly, and is justified only where the applicant has established a prima facie case, and where DNA testing constitutes the only conclusive and scientifically reliable method of resolving the issue. Where determination of biological paternity is necessary to protect the child's long-term welfare, including the child's right to know her biological origins and to have certainty as to her parentage, ordering a DNA test represents a proportionate and legitimate exercise of judicial power. Besides that, in resolving this issue, the High Court applied the doctrine of stare decisis, by following binding and persuasive authorities, recognizing the court's inherent jurisdiction to act in the best interests of a child. The court followed the Court of Appeal's binding decision in Cass v. MPPL and Anor, 2019 4 MLJ 243. Which established that legitimacy and biological paternity are distinct legal concepts, and that Section 112 of the Evidence Act 1950 does not bar judicial inquiry into paternity. This decision was subsequently affirmed by the Federal Court, rendering it binding on the High Court. Moreover, the court relied on English common law authorities, applicable under Section 3(1) of the Civil Law Act 1956, which recognize the court's role as parens patriae in protecting the welfare of children in circumstances where no written law governs the matter. Persuasive authorities from England and India were referred to in support of the court's exercise of inherent jurisdiction, to support the proposition that courts may order DNA testing of a child, where such an order is necessary, to conclusively determine paternity in the child's best interests. Accordingly, the doctrine of stare decisis required the High Court to adhere to established appellate authority, recognizing judicial power to inquire into paternity, and justified extending that principle to authorize DNA testing of a child in the exercise of inherent jurisdiction. In conclusion, the High Court allowed the plaintiff's application and ordered that the child undergo a DNA paternity test. The court further directed that, should the plaintiff be confirmed as the biological father, his reintroduction into the child's life must be carried out gradually and under the supervision of a qualified child psychologist, with liberty granted to the parties to apply for further directions on matters of access and maintenance. The judgment affirms the Malaysian court's readiness to invoke common law and equitable principles, particularly the doctrine of parens patriae, to safeguard the welfare and rights of children in situations where statutory law is silent. In conclusion, both of these cases demonstrate that English common law and equity continue to influence Malaysian law, but their application is carefully regulated. The Civil Law Act 1956 acts as a legal filter, ensuring that foreign legal principles do not override local law. English law can only be applied if it fulfills three conditions, which are lacuna, gap, local circumstances and a cutoff date. In C.A.S. v. MPPL and Anor, 2022 12 MLJ 135, we clearly see Section 3 in operation. When Malaysian law was silent on the issue, the court turned to English common law to fill the gap, but only after satisfying the required conditions. This shows that Section 3 allows flexibility while still safeguarding the integrity of Malaysia's legal system. Meanwhile, Peter Chong and Anor v. Khatijah BTMD Ibrahim and Anor 2018 10 MLJ 735 illustrates Section 6. Which prohibits the automatic use of English law on land and immovable property. In this case, the court navigated carefully around these restrictions, ensuring that local laws and principles controlled the outcome in property matters. Taken together, these cases highlight a careful and balanced approach adopted by Malaysian courts. Rather than blindly following English law, the courts apply it selectively and cautiously, ensuring that Malaysia's legal system continues to evolve, while remaining grounded in its own laws and societal needs. This also ensures Malaysia's legal system grows in a way that is both fair and uniquely suited to its own context.
That's all for our presentation. Thank you.